Keene is a writer and translator, a recent MacArthur Fellow, and the recipient of a Windham-Campbell Prize for fiction. His fiction publications include the books Counternarratives and Annotations. He has published an art book entitled Grind in collaboration with photographer Nicholas Muellner, and the book Seismosis, which features drawings by Christopher Saghaus and explores essayistic and poetic forms. He has also published numerous works of translation from Portuguese, French, and Spanish. He chairs the African American and African Studies Department at Rutgers University, where he also teaches English and creative writing, among other honors. I like to think that good writing creates for the reader a moment of crisis. In an interview with the Creative Independent, Keene talks about writing from the inside out, a thought that sent me into crisis. It didn't prepare me for a yet bigger crisis, which is to have the pleasure of reading Counternarratives, and even that still didn't prepare me for Keene's translation of Hilda Hilst's Letters from a Seducer, which nearly put me in short circuit. His writing and his translations affect us from the inside out too. They aim straight for the heart and travel to our brains, where they find an incredibly stimulating home that is above all ever-changing, like going to a museum to stare at a painting you know you love, but is also somehow surprising every time. Keene's writing reveals an experience that is to be felt and then analyzed, inside to outside. His historical fiction is incredible in the way it brings about a very special emotional connection to where we come from, or so at least for this very eager Brazilian reader. It spotlights forgotten histories and narratives, but I think most of all, it reminds us of the humanity of the storytelling, the studying, and the knowing. Counternarratives is so refreshing because of its original premise, to refuse to be confined in the outlines of history, and instead say, to hell with it all, have we forgotten we're human beings who can be moved by art? Keene's translation of Hilst from the Portuguese evokes the same experience of being put back in touch with some fundamental part of ourselves. It's like the English words were there, waiting to be found and unraveled. The unraveling, of course, is an active pursuit, first done with feeling, then with intellect. In a game of prose where bodily pleasure and language are inextricable from each other, Keene pushes the English like Hilst did the Portuguese, and in the process, he does a thing he's very good at. The text feels to me at once ancient and brand new. History and writing, we have known, are not objective, but Keene reminds us that they're also not static, and neither are they devoid of feeling. This, maybe, is what makes history a matter of the inside, a knowledge that grows from within, rooted in a borderless place, tirelessly delineated by intrusion, but that still connects us to each other and to art.
So, first of all, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction, Rafaela. And thank you, Susan, thank you, Farah, thank you, Columbia, thank you, everyone, for being here. It is incredibly wonderful to walk into a room and to be giving a talk on translation and see the room full. Because usually it's like 10 people. So thank you. Columbia represent. Okay. So what I'm going to do tonight, I'm going to give most of a talk that I gave a very early version of earlier this year at the University of Miami. And I had some thoughts about it. You'll see there's a part where it sort of breaks. And with this talk, I had one sort of creative approach to it in the second part, but I thought, let me go back and actually sort of think this through a little bit. So I'll read all the way up to kind of a certain point, and then I'll just sort of improvise, and then we can open it up to questions and answers. So the talk is entitled, I Place My Foot in the Door and Walk In, Napoleon Rivers and the Practice of Translation as Activism. I want to begin this talk by publicly thanking a fellow writer and translator, the poet, critic, translator, and University of Texas El Paso professor, Rosa Alcalá, who, right before a discussion on translation with me at the Haystack Book Talks last fall, mentioned Napoleon Rivers, whom I'd never heard of. Has anyone ever heard of Napoleon Rivers? And suggested that I explore his work because some of my ideas in my essay, Translating Poetry, Translating Blackness, which I wrote several years ago for a translation dossier on the Poetry Foundation's Harriet site, were consonant with Rivers. And though she didn't add this, I knew it to be the case that I should be familiar with him, with his work and him. So thank you, Rosa, and I urge all of you to check out her work, including her poetry, which is really extraordinary, and her translations of a number of writers, among them the great Chilean poet Cecilia Vicuña. Forgive me also, I was trying to print this out, and I have an iPad, and the iPad, I was able to transfer stuff to the iPad, and now I can't read stuff on it, so I had to bring this computer. So I hope this doesn't appear really rude. Having a computer up here as I'm reading from it. Okay. Je sens les soleils qui naissent à peu feutrés pour réchauffer ma mélanine. Chante l'autre blues, toi la goutte d'eau dans la mer, la rescapée de la méduse, de mangeur, des cloportes et des fruits saumâtres. Je veux sentir mon négritude à fleur de peau, je veux à mon cœur une vie de pétulance. Chante l'autre blues, toi le fretin dans le ciel de la vie, le martinet des saisons sèches et le rossignol éjointé, l'antéchrist au laurier d'épines et de verveine. Je veux frétiller de transe, je veux enjamber les ballonnements de la mémoire à la marron crue. I feel the suns of muffled steps warming my melanin, sing the other blues, you but a drop of water in the sea, survivor of the Medusa, devourer of wood lice and brackish fruits. I want to feel my blackness in the skin's flower. In my heart I want an exuberant rhythm. Sing the other blues, you but a small fry in the ocean of life, the trip hammer of the dry seasons, the nightingale with his wings clipped, the antichrist and the thorny bay trees in Verbena. I want to shimmy in a trance. I want to span the foothills of memory. On November 1st, 1933, a 35-year-old professor of Romance Languages and Literatures at the historically black Agricultural and Technical College, now North Carolina A&T in Greensboro, North Carolina, delivered a paper entitled, quote, "Why Negroes Should Study Romance Languages and Literatures," unquote. Napoleon Rivers, that professor, was speaking at the annual gathering of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History in Washington, D.C., an organization founded by Carter G. Woodson, best known today as the founder of Negro History Week, which eventually became what we now celebrate, and of course when I first gave this paper, in the midst of Black History Month. Like Woodson, who was 13 years his senior, and in whose orbit we would soon regularly move, Rivers was born in the post-Bellum, post-Reconstruction South, in his case in Mobile, Alabama. After attending Talladega College for his BA, his bachelor's degree, his BA, he, like Woodson, had attended the University of Chicago for part of his graduate education, receiving an MA in Romance Languages and Literatures, which of course would have been a huge deal to leave the deeply segregated South and to go to the North, to Chicago, to the University of Chicago, still one of the most elite universities. And like Woodson, had then attended an Ivy League university for his PhD. In Woodson's case, it was Harvard, and Rivers, it was Cornell. Moreover, like Woodson, and nearly everyone else associated with the Association for the Study of Negro Life and Study for Negro Life and History, which continues to this day as the, and it still exists, Association for the Study of African American Life and History, ASALH. Rivers' concerns, even a cursory review of the essay he delivered would underscore, were not merely pedagogical, but profoundly political and cultural. Education was, for Woodson, Rivers, and many others in the milieu, not merely about the disinterested search for knowledge and transmission of ideas and information, but race work, anti-racist work, recuperative, reparative, rehabilitative, proactive. Knowledge was and had to be more than a thing in itself. But I just want to say that this is sort of interesting, because recently I wrote an essay about creative writing programs and what they can learn from Black Studies programs. And this was, of course, this was sort of central to Black studies, African American studies, Africana studies, from the very beginning, right? The knowledge was not simply this disinterested thing, but was sort of central to all of these various sort of functions and roles in the world, particularly for the people engaging in knowledge study and production. Knowledge was and had to be more than a thing in itself. In the ongoing struggle for freedom and equality, African Americans, and as Rivers and others viewed the challenges at hand, Black people throughout the hemisphere and the diaspora, because they were very aware, of course, not just the United States, but of course the entire, New World, and of course Africa, and Black people in other parts of the globe. could not advance without the crucial tools of facts, data, and a deeper sense of the historical, social, political, economic, and cultural archive about themselves, in part to counter the waves of racist and white supremacist propaganda and discourse seeded in all aspects of American life, from popular culture to academia, with buffeted Black people on a daily basis. Moreover, Rutgers believed that that archive extended beyond the borders of the United States, which is to say, beyond the English language barrier. For him and others, like Woodson, American education had actively harmed African Americans and indoctrinated whites and everyone else by teaching that Blacks in the US had not only suffered from the severing of all ties with Africa, something that you still see online, right? You know, the Black people lost everything in the Middle Passage, and there's no continuities, etc. And in fact, people have made very sort of powerful arguments based on this, that are deeply, problematic, and I would just say wrong. But that they were people without any history worthy of note and dehumanized beyond repair by the chattel slave system. In addition, they had been taught that they also were isolated from other Black people across the globe, including in Europe and the Americas, as well as Africa, of course, and that those other Black people's experiences, however much they seemed to parallel those of African Americans, were in key ways fundamentally incommensurate. His talk and life's work aimed to counter this, and in so doing drew upon a series of prior thinkers, going back to Kwabena Otoba Cugoano and the Sons of Africa in the 1790s in London, and Edward Wilmot Blyden in the US and Sierra Leone in the last quarter of the 19th century. By the turn of the 20th century, Pan-Africanism and the related idea of diaspora had begun to animate a number of major thinkers across the globe, who met in 1900 at the first Pan-African Conference in London. As is well known, the conference's chief organizer was the Trinidadian, Henry Sylvester Williams, who drew 37 participants and 10 observers from the continent of Africa, the Caribbean, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Among the best known was W.B. Du Bois, then a young professor at Lannan University, but among its other notable participants were American author and sociologist, Black American author, sociologist, and radical activist Anna Julia Cooper, Antonin Filmin, the Haitian anthropologist, author, and government minister, and Dadabai Naoroji, a Parsi intellectual, teacher, businessman, and British MP, suggesting that among the organizers and participants, the belief in who could speak to and about the concept of Africanness and Blackness was more expansive than we might even imagine today. And I think it's also interesting that, there was this sense of Blackness as a kind of larger project that went beyond skin color or even strictly Africanness as we know it, right? It was more expensive than we might even imagine today, and it also was inextricably linked to anti-colonialism and decolonization as well as anti-imperialism. By the time that he delivered his talk in 1933, some 3 decades later, during what David Logan Lewis has identified as some 3 decades later, during what David Logan Lewis has identified as the final period of the Harlem Renaissance, and in the wake of a series of Pan-African conferences before and after the First World War, Pan-Africanism and diasporicism had long watered the soil of certain sectors of Black thought in America and beyond, ranging from Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association to the writers who would convene under the banner of Negritude. Rivers was thus not alone in his view that adopting a broader scope for understanding the Black world and Black people was key. To that end, he opened his paper first by emphasizing the value of knowing 2 languages, which he stated an ancient Persian proverb described as having 2 souls, before citing Napoleon Bonaparte's dictum to his soldiers to learn the language of the conquered, doubling their combat value, which is shocking. Yeah, it's like, okay. And Johann Wolfgang from Goethe's famous apothegm, that a poet that, I love this, the poet that knew no language other than their own could not understand their own. By the second paragraph, however, Rivers had shifted to the main focus of his talk, which was that the, quote, Negro, unquote, could find, quote, practical reasons to make a special case for himself with respect to Romance languages and literatures, unquote. I should note here that Rivers' focus on Western European languages may seem narrow to us today, but I see it as arising out of the particularities of his training, the prestige of these languages in American academia and cultural life at that time, if not perhaps as much as today, and I think we can probably say that. I mean, while things have changed, it still tends to be the case that, in another paper where I talk about translating poetry, it turns out that the majority of material, literary texts translated into English actually are from European languages. More so than today, East Asian languages or African, indigenous African languages, etc. See, I rise by particularities of his training, the prestige of these languages in American academia and cultural life at the time, if not perhaps as much today, and the accessibility during that era of the archives in these languages, especially with regard to Black figures and subject matter, compared to those of other non-classical European languages and literatures, as well as non-European languages, including the indigenous, Creole, and Pidgin languages of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The practical reasons he gives are worth quoting in full and provide the schema he will expound upon throughout the rest of the essay. And this is a full quote. Briefly, the Negro should study the Romance languages and literatures in order to, 1, increase his knowledge of the history and literature of his race. 2, to combat falsehood with truth by searching the sources in these languages and bringing to light important facts which have been obscured, falsified, or omitted, and to rehabilitate distinguished personages of African descent who have contributed richly to world culture that have been detracted or omitted in English, in books printed in the English language. 3, to compete more effectively for additional economic opportunities at home and abroad. I think I love that, that little bit of Black capitalism in there. You know another language, you can go look for, work overseas, right? And we know that people did this. I mean, for example, Langston Hughes' father, in Spanish, being fluent in Spanish, was able to actually work in Mexico in a way that he could not do in the United States. And 4, to open up for himself a newer and a larger world of ideas, which I think is so interesting, this idea of a kind of vista of ideas opening up if you can speak another language. So, studying Romance languages and literatures, which is to say, learn to read, write, speak, and translate from them into these languages, would aid African Americans not only in the quote, practical ways, unquote, that Rivers identifies for listeners, for advanced work in humanistic, scientific, or professional studying fields, to improve their grasp of English, and to increase, as Rivers says, quote, the capital stock of one's culture, unquote. More importantly for him, and he hoped his audience, was to grasp that knowing and having facility in these languages would open up a richer vista upon a Black past, and presumably a Black present, that lay hidden, often overtly concealed, because of a lack of access to a body of knowledge beyond the limits of English, while also arming Black people with, quote, the truth, of facts, unquote, to counter the steady tide of anti-Black racist disinformation and misinformation and historical and cultural religion propagated not only in American mass culture, but in all aspects of U.S. society, including academia. He emphasized knowledge of a Romance language as yet another potentially beneficial economic tool in hand. And Rivers' writing during the Great Depression was clear here and elsewhere in the paper about the need for practicality in this most basic sense. And this is also another thing we see so often in this discourse is this idea, we get some of this in the discourse of the work of Booker T. Washington, right? This idea that you having a practical skill, when things really get bad, means that you'll be able to eat, right? To live and to eat. And it ended with the notion that this linguistic facility would allow African Americans to engage with the newer and larger world of ideas not delimited by and to the Anglosphere, which is to say a larger Black intellectual world that very likely was not going to be of interest to anti-Black racists who control the U.S. levels of power and access. As a result of the distorted, often grotesque image of African Americans that have been cultivated and which have taken root across American society, Rivers argued, Black people in the U.S. had almost no knowledge of their history and civilization. And this critical lack is particularly harmful given the systemic and structural forms of racism, in part designed based on racist and white supremacist ideas and foundations that they faced on a daily basis. Here he mirrored the arguments not only of Carter G. Woodson and Du Bois in their writings, and of course everyone others, but autodidactic figures like J.A. Rogers, whose books From Superman to Men, Nature Knows No Color Line, World's Great Men of Color, and the multi-volume Sex and Grace, and of course my favorite that we used to mention when I would go to the barbershop when I was in my teen years at 20 and 25 Negro presidents, right? Attempted to form an intellectual, critical, and theoretical redress. Yet for the scholar and researcher Rivers, careful exploration of the non-Anglophone archive offered a key, special key, not least because of the long history of contact going back to post-Hellenic and Roman eras between Europeans along the Mediterranean basin and Africa, which lay just across the water. In fact, as he went on to point out, going language to language and country by country, first in Europe and then in Africa and the Americas. Not only were the histories of the regions in which the Romance languages developed and flourished marked by the significant African presence. And I'm thinking of now someone like Frank Snowden, the great classical scholar who wrote a book early on, basically detailing very careful scholarship, the Black presence in the classical era. And then, of course, there were other books that came along, including a major controversy, which I won't go into. Right now, not only were the history of the regions in which the Romance languages developed were marked by the significant African presence and the extensive interaction that followed, but an array of figures he enumerated, some well known, others less so, including people not identified by Rogers and others, were known and named as being of African descent in those languages and histories, and thus legible as Black in an archive to which those who did not speak or read the language, which is to say most African Americans, had little to no access. Indeed, in the talk, he even cites some of these sources, such as when discussing the Africans who fought, quote, as officers and common soldiers under Spanish arms in the revolt of the Netherlands. He cites Spanish Golden Age playwright Andrés de Claramonte, whose drama on a particularly notable warrior was titled El Valiente Negro in Flandes. Prefacing this snippet of history, Rivers pointed out that such a fact, quote, is not stressed in the usual histories of Spain written in English, which is to say they have been omitted, elided, or outright erased. What I want to note is that Rivers is arguing not only that people of African descent have a far richer history and civilization, as problematic as that term is, than they, we, and everyone else were ever taught or not, an issue relevant not only for his moment, but still today, as we see with the widespread ignorance around blackface minstrelsy, the still one pressing issue. When I was writing this, of course, there was the scandal involving the governor of Virginia, and then I think it was in the lieutenant governor, a different scandal, and then there was another blackface scandal involving the Attorney General, whatever. So there's several people involved in this blackface scandal. And people kept saying, "Well, why are people showing we're wearing blackface?" Like, come on, people! This was American culture. This stuff is deep. I mean, it's like embedded in this culture. It's like it has a, as I was saying at dinner, it has a half-life. It's like kind of pushed down in the soil and it just keeps popping up like mushrooms or something. The Black people played key roles in civilizing, to take this precedent, but heretically for white supremacists, that Black people also played key roles in civilizing Romance-speaking Europe, or were important agents during central moments in Europe's history of civilization. One could also quite easily argue that not only were African Americans in 1933 aware of this history, but that a good deal of Europeans in those very nations and regions, as well as white Americans today, remain unaware of the complex truth of this past, as recent racist incidents at a classical studies conference and imbroglios about new scholarship in medieval studies underscore. And I would say that, it's really sort of interesting how, these battles are happening in real time. So there's, some of you may know in medieval studies, a huge uproar because even something that's seemingly as uncontroversial as scholars talking about how statuary, like this classical statuary, were actually brightly painted, right? And not only were they brightly painted, but sometimes, of course, they were colored in terms of the, sort of racially delineated, has caused this huge backlash online. In certain cases by medieval scholars, or classical medieval scholars, but then, but people have said no, the statuary should be white, it should be pure, it should be, pristine, it should be timeless, right? And it's like, no, we actually want to kind of just properly historicize it and talk about it. So anyway, and of course, that was the classical studies and medieval studies, right? There's the issue of, this question of, the presence of black people, for example, in various parts of Europe, and how scholars have identified this fact, it's led to some backlash. Rivers here calls out not only white American scholars of Romance languages and literatures, but also white translators. This is interesting. Who, not unlike certain historians of American history he knows, produced, quote, a flow of lies in the form of English translations, lectures, interpretations, and appraisals on all matters concerning foreign Negroes, adding that, quote, they belittle the Negro by omission, misinterpretation, or downright falsification. To put it another way, in their effort to brainwash and gaslight black Americans and everyone else, because of course it's everybody they're trying to get brainwashed, to buy into supposed black racial inferiority, Rivers argues that white scholars, critics, and translators had actively participated in miseducation of black people in the U.S. through miseducation about and misrepresentation of black people outside the U.S., which is interesting. So it's not just inside the U.S., but it's outside the U.S. That this is the history that we are being given because, through translation. Erasure, silence, and negation. He will have none of it. I love this part. Rivers goes on to explicitly name some of these scholars, beginning with his former University of Chicago professor, H. Carrington Lancaster, whose dismissive estimation of Alexandre Dumas père and Alexandre Dumas fils, two of the leading lights of 19th century French letters, in contrast with the white French scholar, Albert Chinard, who offered a diametrically opposed assessment. Though an intrepid researcher perhaps might find a French scholar from that era or even today with a less positive reading, informed in part by racism, of the value and talent of the Dumas duo. Rivers' ultimate point about Lancaster and a host of other scholars, critics, journalists, translators he cites anonymously or calls out by name, is that being black and able to read these writers and the other historical and cultural figures he invokes, being able to pour through contemporaneous accounts, criticism, biographical material, literature, ephemera, and so forth about them in the original, and not mediated by a white racist Anglophone filter, is crucial. And it is a skill he's urging his peers at the Association for Research and Study of Negro Life to cultivate among themselves and the students they train and encounter. In other words, Rivers is stressing that possessing the ability to translate work from these languages is, in essence, anti-racist practice. Translation and scholarship in these languages marks a form of empowering and invaluable race work to and for him and for black Americans more generally, establishing, in C.L. R. James's term, a kinship, quote, beyond a boundary. He even states this point blank when he notes that, quote, those Negroes who are willing to learn these languages, which they would use as tools in research for this cause, unquote, will essentially be countering, quote, the American scholarship that does not scruple misinterpretation. It is no surprise, then, that 2 years later, and by then head of the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures at the Minor Teachers College, later to become the University of the District of Columbia, he wrote to W.E.B. Du Bois offering his services in drafting articles on, quote, persons of the Negro race who have left their imprint in French, Italian, Spanish, and German literatures and histories within the following geographical regions. This is great. The continent, Central and South America, and the islands of the Caribbean. Based in part, I surmise, on original and archival research for Du Bois's Encyclopedia of the Negro. Now, my aim is not to recapitulate Rivers' entire essay, which diverges into other areas not of immediate concern for my purposes here. I also want to note that in as much as Rivers is offering a powerful anti-racist critique about U.S. practices, he at times can be a bit blinkered about racism overseas, trafficking in a romantic naivete around colorblindness in the absence of racism in non-U.S. societies, and at times re-inscribing a heroic or great black man of history discourse, who acknowledged the era in which he was writing and his experiences as an African American who moved through European societies as a soldier during World War II. Instead, I want to sit with the essay's final movement before I shift to the second and shorter part of this talk. In it, Rivers champions, quote, the new world of ideas that black readers of Romance languages will find by black writers in those languages to which they previously had no direct access. He counsels against servilely imitating these non-US, non-English models, instead suggesting that, quote, there prevails an atmosphere, as well as numerous aesthetic possibilities and elements, which encourages creativeness that is scarcely available for him in the literature, culture, and arts of his oppressor. In other words, rather than wrestling with the aesthetic templates handed down by white predecessors and peers, which at this moment in time would have included the entire corpus of the English literary tradition and nearly 300 years of U.S. literature, and from which black writers have written in the past and in the present day, his present day, and most have been ignored, excluded, fetishized, or marginalized, Rivers is actively advocating an artistic and intellectual dialogue with black writers in one portion of diaspora, the segment he knows best, and in which he can imagine new forms emerging not shaped or warped by the oppressive, conventional, and approved models and forms usually bequeathed to African Americans. One could add a count to the many of Rivers' contemporaries among the Harlem Renaissance writers had already begun to choose an alternative path. Black vernacular, proletariat, and folk culture suffused, as we now know, with an array of Africanisms and carryovers. One thing I find telling is that in the essay, Rivers identifies a number of notable writers he urges his listeners to explore, in one case, retranslate, in part to rectify the absence of their voices in English, as well as the bowdlerized versions that in a few cases did exist. Yet, looking back some 86 years later, it is very likely the case that many of these figures, including the Haitian novelist Frédéric Masséna, the 19th century Cuban poets Ambrosio Echemendia and Francisco Diaz-Silveira, and the 20th century figures Regino Pedroso, Regino Belti, and Gerardo Jimenez, and the Martinican writer René Morin, the first black person to win France's prestigious Goncourt Prize for his novel Batuala, were translated then, and they haven't really been translated or retranslated that much since. In the case of Belti and Jimenez, they even received a second boost in 1933 from Arturo A. Schomburg, founder of what became the world-famous Schomburg Library for Research in Black Culture, in his contemporaneous opportunity essay, My Trip to Cuba in Quest of Negro Books, which I have. For Morin, translation of his prize-winning novel into English occurred in 1921. As Rivers notes, the author expressed bitterness and embarrassment over the mutilation of his prize-winning novel by the inept and stupid American translation done by an American white. To this roster, one could now add thousands more still waiting to be translated at even one-hundredth of the rate of their non-black peers. Rather ironically, the one black poet of that era actively took up Rivers' charge to read, speak, and translate in Romance languages was Langston Hughes, the very poet whose translations comprised, quote, only quatrains and sophisticated light verses, as it was described. Hughes would go on to translate considerably more demanding work by Cuban poet Nicholas Muellner and the Haitian author Jacques Roumain, as well as poetry by Spaniard Federico Garcia Lorca and Chilean Gabriela Mistral. Napoleon Rivers passed away at the age of 82 in 1980. His work, or rather the call he extended in 1933, I want to suggest remains unfulfilled. And so, I mean, I have a little bit more here, but I'll sort of skip over that and just sort of say that, so I kind of, in another essay, Translating Blackness, I make a case for translating the work of black writers. And one of the things that I was thinking about, and I didn't know about Rivers at the time, was the way in which one of the key things I was thinking about was not only its role, for example, in sort of anti-racist practice, dialogue, but I was really also interested in what I describe as a kind of counter-hegemonic move, because I feel like there's a way in which, and anyone who has the good fortune to travel and is black and goes across the globe sees very quickly that American cultural products and black American cultural products travel, just as everything from the United States travels. And there is a dialogue that's happening in other places. But one of the things that I'm sort of fascinated by is, our lack of access to it. I mean, even when it comes to movies or music, et cetera, right? So you go to different places. I mean, I just think about the times that, for example, I've been to Brazil or Dominican Republic, I went to Cuba, and you see, I mean, the sort of knowledge of what's happening in the United States, particularly around black American culture, is really sort of interesting, engaged, much deeper than, for example, what we often know in a sort of a broader sense, both black Americans and Americans in general. So I was really kind of interested in that and thinking about, that was one sort of component of that essay. And so I wanted to sort of follow up here and just to kind of make the point that I think it would be Really interesting to think about, as I was saying, not just translation of literary texts, which is the focus of my other talk, but really sort of a wide range of cultural production, right? Particularly, I'm thinking now, given our sort of current political moment, about work that is more overtly political, work that is more overtly activist, the kind of text that, cultural products probably would be the last to be translated, right? What would it mean to basically bring these in to English and to give us a sense, a deeper and richer sense of what people sort of outside the U.S. across the globe are doing, right? Without this idea, the assumption that they would be able to read and speak English, and if they can't, then the dialogue can only go one way. So I'll actually stop there. And how's that in terms of time? Okay, so I'll stop and I'll open up the floor to questions.
Another question. So Emily Wilson's Odyssey, there's so many things to say about it. It's an incredibly beautiful work. But she talks explicitly, people talk about it as a feminist translation. And when she talks about the work she did in it, she says, well, I didn't put any feminism in it, I just removed the misogyny from it. So she talks about, for example, one little brief example is, there are all these words that are used for the young women who are enslaved and who are in the house and are being used for sex, and they're enslaved. And in the different translations, they're called, the whores, the concubines, the blah, blah, blah. And the Greek word just said female person, and she translates them, the girls, to emphasize their youth, female. And, it's a feminist work. And I wonder if new translations of work that would remove anti-blackness from them, is that a similar project? Is it a different project, from the work, from the point of view of the translator going in there artistically, or do you see it as different in some ways from that project?
Well, I think there are a lot of similarities there, right? Because on the one hand, you want to be as true to the work as possible, but on the other hand, you really have to sort of think about, particularly work when it comes to works from particular periods, right? Where, for example, races, it's still current, but it was much more sort of overt, right? Now, how do you deal with text that, let's say, are ironizing it, but it's still there? So, I think there are ways to do it, and that is something that I think when it comes to training. Because one of the things that I say in the next little section here is, so I talk a little bit more about rivers, and one of the things that I do say is that I do think there's some very interesting work, sort of critical work that's happening now. I know someone was telling me that one of the professors here, Brett Haynes-Edwards, is doing some wonderful work. And there are many others who are really thinking about translation and, sort of theorizing it, but also people who are engaging in translation, sort of the practice of translation, and trying to think, right, how do I grapple with, right, some of those challenges that in the past, were that sort of reinscribed the problems that exist in the text, right? But how do I do this now for a new era, right? That speaks to our current moment.
One of the things that I was thinking about was, well, first of all, I feel like I'm just speaking very formal. I feel like I'm a Black Studies person, and I like to think that sometimes I cheat on Black Studies with complet or translation studies. But I think work like yours is really inspiring in terms of maybe what the kids call non-monogamy. But anyway, so my real question is, so I have a question about language learning, because I didn't read the essay. I would love for you to talk about the essay. I was looking through it, and you were talking a lot about, I'm I'm an amateur translator who didn't learn, I learned French in public school. You know, I didn't grow up in a bilingual household. So language learning is a question. My other question is, at the very beginning of the talk, you were like, je veux sentir mon négritude. And you translated that as I want to feel my blackness. And like negritude obviously is like an anglicized word that could be, so I just wanted to know more about that translation, and I think I'm done, 'cause I'm getting really awkward sitting here.
Oh, no, that's great. Thank you. Okay, so first of all, about language learning, I mean, this is a real challenge, right? You know, I say in the little section of this essay, you know, that, you know, for example, my parents were in segregated schools in St. Louis. You know, they had French and Spanish, right? So they, you know, my mother has these great stories about how she would make her name into a Z so she'd get to sit in the back of the class, right? And, you know, and the French teacher, for whatever reason, couldn't ever figure out that my mother's maiden name's not, you know, began with a Z. It's like, how's that possible? But anyway, so this was, you know, this was in the 50s, right? Of course, one of the things that we've seen is that, like, you know, foreign language education has been eviscerated, right? You know, under the neoliberal capitalist model that we live under today. So part of the challenge is, right, you know, how do you introduce, how do people get introduced to languages if they're not growing up in bilingual families? And one of the things that I was saying, you know, at dinner was that, because the corollary to that is that we at Rutgers Newark, we have, it's the most diverse campus in the United States, and we have a large number of students who grow up speaking languages other than English, and you know they've never been made to feel that that this is a good thing, right? You know, and I often say take this idea that it's like having a superpower, right? You know, you love superheroes. This is a superpower, right? Because you can actually do something that a large number of people can't do, which is and I understand. I mean, taking into account the feelings. The shame, the feeling of it being a burden because you have to translate for your parents who can't, struggle with English, who can't speak English, etc. But, so finding ways to empower them. So we came up with a program called Lives in Translation. And part of what we have done with that is to, figure out ways for the students to use these language skills in New Jersey, which is super diverse, and get, some kind of credit for it. But in terms of language learning, right, I think there are a lot of barriers out there, and so one of the things is, if you're thinking about translation, it's easier, of course, to learn a language when you're young than when you get older, but you can always learn another language. And the interesting thing is that I just sound like someone who's reading, I don't know, Huffington Post or something like that. But I came across this article that said something like, if you learn a language, and one of the best things for the brain, right, is to learn another language, right? Do math problems, draw, and learn another language, right? So, in a sense, right, it is this net positive. But, just thinking about if you went into translation, it definitely is doable. And you might never develop, the facility clearly of someone who is completely immersed in a given language. But the interesting thing is, I'm always sort of fascinated by just having the experience of my own work translated into other languages, and that happened a few times. And how, there's certain things that are kind of like a sort of default in my brain. And then when a translator goes through them, they'll ask me questions, and it's just like, I had never thought of that. So I have to sort of justify these choices I'm making, and it makes me think, which I translate myself, but it makes me kind of rethink. Okay, I have to sort of retrace the thread of my thought. So it's actually incredibly productive even for your own thought process. And then as I said, and the conservatives is arguing, and as I've argued elsewhere, it's just a very, very important thing to do. We badly need it now. And as I'm saying, particularly in our moment of this moment of like just ever-rising nationalism. Right? And one of the other things I think that's really so important about what the argument Rutgers is making here is, at another level, it's an anti-nationalist argument. Because he's saying that the sort of limits of the United States or even the limits of Black people in the United States are not the limits of your world, right? The world, your world is the entire world, right? There are all these other voices out there that are speaking to you and that you can speak to once you learn that other language. In terms of translating Lannan Literary, I translated negritude as blackness. Okay, now we lose the resonance, right? Because of course negritude means blackness in French. But, and of course Mawaku, being a sub-Saharan African author who's quite aware of, he wrote a beautiful book about James Baldwin, and is quite aware of the Harlem Renaissance and of, just really the entire corpus of 19th, 20th century Black literature, would know, of course, when the resonance of negritude for a French speaker and for an English speaker. But I felt like if I translated it as my negritude, then we lose something even more foundational, which is that he's making a case for his blackness in relation to Congo, which is what he's writing about. So, great questions.
So when it comes to translating writers of African descent in Latin America, or from Latin America, they're in a context, most likely, where when it needs to have a Black identity and how blackness is conceived in their country, and you reference some of these things in your talk already, is quite different. So I'm curious about what are the ethical responsibilities, if any, for the translator in translating these particular writers, especially thinking about if they translate them and then their writing can be misconstrued in the way that we think about blackness and Black identity. And so what are if there are any ethical responsibilities for the translator in prefacing it, or is it responsibility of the reader or scholars?
Okay, so I'm going to read this. I love that you asked, because I was going to read this, but I said I'm running out of time. This is by Cristiana Sobral, who's a contemporary Brazilian writer, Afro-Brazilian writer. And I believe she is here in the United States, and she just was in Pittsburgh, but I don't think she's coming to New York. But this is called Retina Negra. Sou preta fujana, recuso ver diariamente o espelho, que tento me massacrar por dentro, que tento me iludir com mentiras brancas, que tenta me descolorir com os seus feixes de luz. Sou preta fujana, preparada para enfrentar o sistema, empino o black, sem problema, e valor a cena. Sou preta fujana, defendo o esclarecimento necessário, tiro qualquer registro do armário, enfio o pé na porta e entro. I'm a Black rebel woman. I reject the mirror daily, which tries to massacre me inside, which tries to deceive me with white lies, which tries to feed me with its rays of light. I'm a Black rebel woman, ready to face the system. I drum up the black without a hitch. I bum rush the stage. I'm a Black rebel woman. I advocate a needed darkening. I shoot any racists in the closet. I shove my foot in the door and walk in. Okay? Now, let me just say that you asked an excellent question, and that is that as a translator of any other writer, you always proceed, I believe, from an ethical foundation, which is that you are aware of the limits of your knowledge, of your ability to bring something from one language into the other, right? That you make an attempt to learn something about that writer's culture, background, voice, everything. And that you are willing to admit failure, right? That you are not going to get it sometimes. You're just not, right? That's never stopped people, right? But you're just not going to get it. What's really fascinating to me, for example, about translating contemporary Brazilian writers, is that Brazil has had waves of racial consciousness, particularly Black consciousness. And writers right now in Brazil has some very exciting writing happening. Okay? It's not just writing, it's culture in general, right? Particularly Black culture. But the vast majority of this work does not get translated into English, right? So, I was in a conversation a few years ago with the head of the Grupo Gay de Bahia, who was an Afro-Brazilian, Marcelo Siqueira. And, we were having this conversation, and so we exchanged an interview, and, he was telling me about, he was sort of citing all these, American pop culture things, and I was just like, how do you know this, right? And I had something very similar with another person, Valdez Souza, another writer, who's there in Bahia. And, in both cases, they're very aware of what's happening here, but we, it's like, I think if you ask most people, people know where Bahia is, they know a little bit about Brazil, but they, maybe they know something about the political system, but they have no idea about the films, the music, etc., right? And this cross-cultural conversation is happening. So, when I was translating Cristiano Sobral, first of all, there were challenges in terms of, language itself, and, trying to learn something about her. And I was working with the wonderful translator Eric Backer, on a special issue of Afro-Brazilian writing. And, Eric is very, very good in terms of catching little things like this. One of the things I was thinking about with this poem is, even given the limits in terms of fully understanding it the first read through, I got the feeling. And that's another thing I think that we don't ever want to lose sight of, because that's one of the most difficult things to capture and bring into another language. But when we do, I heard people, when I got to that end, that when she says, I said, I don't rush the stage, right? I love that, about the Santa, right? There's a probably stricter translation, more, correct translation in terms of exactly what the words say. But I could feel that she was saying something along those lines, right? Because this is a form of resistance, right? And how do you capture that feeling, right? How do you capture that trace, those traces, right? That can very easily be lost, right? And so that to me is a very ethical thing to try and do. And to, again, acknowledging your limits and failure, right? Because someone else might come along and say, well, no, I think actually should do this. And I used to do this thing where I had a blog, and I still do it, right, on the blog now. And I would post translations on the blog. And there was, when I would do translations from Spanish, which were always, full of errors. There was a guy who would come in and we had these wonderful debates, right? So I was actually learning, I was like, okay, this is a free way to learn how to translate, Spanish language poetry, right? But primarily like, Afro-Latino writers. But he had these really interesting, like, say, what about this nuance, or what about this nuance? And it was, I was always learning something, and so it's like, okay, having humility to say, you're right, actually. But then sometimes I would push back. So there was a poem, I think, by the Cuban poet Seducer that was very brief poem, but again, he uses English in the poem and everything. And I think I believed I had a better translation than the other person. But it was great because it was like a little workshop, to try to get it right.
Thank you for mentioning Seducer, because I had a question on how you view the artist and translator in communication with the artist that you're translating. So I'm interested in this process where Seducer has been translated multiple times, but he's quite maxed in the ways that Afro-Cuban existence is entirely deleted in the translation. But at times by people like John Cage to make a ballet, but it's a ballet, it's not Seducer. In that way, I wonder how you might feel about your own writing being in response to those spaces that can't be translated, whether it be adopting a form of the Gothic Portuguese text into a novella, or the ways in which poet Rita Dove has an entire epic poem about Beethoven's lover. How do you feel about these ways in which artists try to communicate that lack with their own work? Do you feel that that incorrectly transposes, like it overwrites the author's intention, or do you feel it's more commodified?
That's a fascinating question. I think, part of what I think as many writers are trying to do is, there's this whole idea of expressing the inexpressible, the ineffable, right? And not to say that you're trying to write the sublime, right? Although sometimes that's what you're trying to do. But how do you communicate the incommunicable, right? Something that is lived and felt and experienced, right? But sort of eludes the easy grasp, or even complex grasp of language. That's a real challenge. And speaking of, I looked at Raphael and mentioned the translation of Hilda Hilst's work, because one of the great challenges with that book, I mean, there were a lot of challenges with Hilst's work. But one of the challenges was that, I was translating the work of a woman writer who had been, to a great degree, either ignored or sort of caricatured. Okay? So she was acclaimed as a poet, and she had a kind of cult following, and then she, around the time the dictatorship took hold in the late 60s, she switched first to plays, she wrote remarkable plays, and then she switches to prose. And there's a way in which the prose is, I see it as a kind of continuous act of resistance, right? But it usually is, it's not overtly political, in the sense we usually think of political. But it was kind of ignored. It was like she's this experimental writer, and she's sort of characterized as crazy, and she had a thing called Casa do Sol, where artists would come through and everything, so she was kind of bohemian, and the Brazilian literary world didn't really know what to do with her. And so she really wanted readers, right? And this was brilliant. She wanted readers, so she comes up with this idea to utilize the discourse of pornography, because of course, she said, asked the question, I guess, what do many people want to read, or what are they interested in? Well, I read pornography, but it's not, she's really read pornography. But I say this to say that, to being aware of that's a kind of writing from no space, right? Writing from a place of such marginalization, right? That, your peers, I mean, she was friends actually toward the end of her life with the very great and very highly regarded Brazilian writer, Hilda Hilst. She won the Camões Prize, which is the highest prize in the Portuguese language. They were friends from the time they were young women, and Teleshow was, Teleshow was supporting her as a fellow writer. But people didn't know what to do with those. And so, I think that was something I was always trying to think, how do you communicate that non-space, that impossibility, right? It was very, very difficult. And the interesting thing is that when Hilst died, if you open up, the Folha de São Paulo, the major paper in São Paulo, or, Globe or something, they all mentioned, that she wrote the, porno chic, and there's, in fact, one novel I would say to people could not be translated. If you translate it in English, you'd be arrested. But there was something, there was a method to that madness, right? It was not just to be outrageous, but it was trying to do something. And the novel that I translated, I think, is one of the most profound novels about writing, right? And writing is an ethical act that you define. So thanks for the question.
Can we talk more about the Hilst translation? I was just wondering, because it is so linked with the aspects of pleasure and sensuality are so linked with the language and the writings. I agree with you that it's essentially, I think, about writing. What were some of the challenges that you came up with, linguistically, that were kind of tough to work through? Because I think it's crazy how consistent it is, and both hers and yours, obviously, and I'm just wondering, what kind of, how will you get yourself to that space where you can find that very specific language to bring about that bodily sensation of the original?
It was a real challenge. So one of the things to say about Hilst was, she was, I said, brilliant, and she used every register in Brazilian Portuguese. So she has words that you would find in a fishing village in the northeast of Brazil. She has words that, that would be in a, medieval Portuguese text. She even has this whole series of poems that use these much older forms, right? But of course, they're highly erotic, so she's got all these erotic poems to God. People did not know what to do with, her work. And then the other interesting thing about Hilst was, I believe I got this right, her mother was from Portugal. So she loved to read her work or read poems or her own work, other people's work, aloud in a European Portuguese accent, which is of course quite distinctive. So of course people would just like, fall over in laughter, right? But of course the thing was, it was funny, but again, she was doing something very interesting in terms of like, that relationship between the different versions of Portuguese. So there were a lot of challenges to translate that book. And then she even has, she has a poem in the beginning, and then she has these abrupt, very good writers do this, right? And particularly in English. So if you are in an MFA class and you have these abrupt, she's not the only Brazilian writer who does this, okay? I'll give you another example. But she has these abrupt shifts, like, not just in terms of register, but like the sentences will do this, right? And so even if she breaks them up, like they dart in different directions. When you do that in English, it sounds very strange. So I'll say I was translating the work of, for example, the writer Jean Willis, who's also a legislator. He had recently, I guess, earlier this year, flew Brazil because of death threats. But his work, he does this, he has like extremely concise, condensed prose. And in English, you always want to fill it in. The same is true, for example, of the Brazilian writer from the south of Brazil, João Gilberto Nall, who does something very simple, where he'll have like, sentences, and then it just almost like, it seems like something that just got chopped off, and he jumps to the next thing, right? So they have the jump cuts. But hers are like switches, right? So part of what I had to say to myself was, it is okay if it does not sound like conventional American prose, which is a challenge. Because when you read it, you think the reader's going to read this, and think, what earth am I reading, right? So that was one, sort of at a macro level. At a micro level, she uses, as I said, all these terms. So one of my favorites is she uses the term "comessa." English has a word that's almost exactly the same called "kermesse," which means country fair. And the context, it uses this term. A word for kermesse, right? It's a German word, right? It comes from German, kermesse, right? Yeah, kermesse. So you could put this in like, I don't know, article or something, but most people are going to say, I'm going to go to kermesse this weekend. But you lose, and so the context is that the character Cordelia is living in the country. So her brother is writing to her in the country. However, the other meaning of this word is high-class orgy. So he's basically saying to her, well, I bet you hang on high-class orgy. You knit these handkerchiefs, handkerchiefs and that. I know what you're really doing. And I was like, there is just no way under the sun to bring that into English. How do you do that? Because these terms, they're like one's here and one's here in English, whereas in Portuguese are here. So there were a lot of things like that. Then there's one last thing I'll say about this. There were words, she sort of creates words. Many writers do this, right? And I'm trying to think of blank on the name of who wrote, Devil to Play in the Backrooms. It won't come to me. The number of writers. Guimarães Rosa. Thank you. Same here. Guimarães Rosa. Guimarães Rosa starts, Grandes Otavares with a word that is a non-word, no nada. Right? It's not a word in those Portuguese speakers. It's like, but it's multiple words. It's no, now, nada, not born, no, nothing, right? In the born thing, so in the nothing, right? So she doesn't do a lot of that, but there were moments where she did this, and so, I would ask people that I knew. There's a writer who's a friend of mine, and I asked him a few times about some of these words, and he was like, I have no idea what she's talking about. So I had to reverse engineer to come up with it. So there were a lot of challenges, But I think even with its flaws, the book, you get a strong sense of Hilst, right? I think the power comes through, and by the time you reach the end of that book, it's so exquisitely beautiful, and heartbreaking, right? Because this character is basically saying, I've given up everything to become a writer, and nothing I'm doing is registering. And yet you have the irony of this book, which is, I mean, it's basically huge. This book that survives her and lives on, right, and continues to be read. Yes.
I was curious to know your thoughts about anthologies and what the possibilities and limitations of anthologies in terms of whether it's an activist translation, translation taking up representation. And two examples I'm thinking of are one, our colleague Tiffany Higgins is putting together an anthology of Black Brazilian writers. And the Translation Press recently contacted me because they're starting a new imprint that's all anthologies. And they were interested in names for an anthology of LGBTQ Brazilian writers. So yeah, so I thought, if there are some of the pros and cons, or if there are anthologies you would like to see, or just translations in general that you'd like to see.
Well, this is one of the rare times that I'm going to quote the author Wallace Stevens. He said, so I'm being very ironic here. He says the anthologies has no schools. I totally disagree with that. I think anthologies are incredibly important. Anthologies are how many of us are introduced to other literatures, right? I can think of any number of anthologies that I picked up when I was younger, and that's how I was introduced to the writers from different parts of the world, right? And the problem with anthologies is that, someone is always left out, right? Someone is always excluded. The beneficial aspect of anthologies, though, is that you do include people. You can do all kinds of recuperative and reparative work, right? You can actually, I think of that beautiful little anthology. It was actually a journal issue edited by Manu Kaza, right? Where she has people, she gets this beautiful introduction where she's talking about translation and these other kinds of ways that we usually hear translation discussed. And then she's got this range of writers sharing their translations. And it's not the usual sorts of translations. So I think anthologies are very, very important. And I just wish that, publishers, it's great that there are publishers who are willing to do them and are very interested. And I wish there were more who would be willing to do it because I think, they're invaluable. So.
She teaches you in the spring semester.
Oh, good, that's great.
And I had a class called Kitchen Table Translation.
It's excellent. Yeah,
That's the book.
yeah, that's the name of the book. It's great. Yes. Okay.
There's more questions. I mean, I've heard you guys.
Yes, we will.
I wanted to ask, about an ethical imperative for translation. In your own translations, they're incredibly writerly. For all the, political, positioning that's part of the project, you bring your own immense skill as a writer to your translations, and you, I think with the writer that you are translating, and just the colorfulness of the language. It's the kind of vividness that one doesn't always find in translation. One finds more often in original writing, and I'm wondering if that's an ethical imperative or if it's some other sort of thing that you bring. Do we have a responsibility to be writers as translators? And is that ever in conflict with other responsibilities we have?
Okay, well, that's a great question, and I think Keene talks about this a good deal in this little arc. I think that's the title of it. And other writers have talked about this too. We have you and many wonderful translators here. It's a challenge, because there is the imperative, of course, to bring something into another language, and then there is the challenge of what is that original text? Sometimes texts that are seemingly simple are some of the most difficult. I can think about when I first began. I taught myself Portuguese, and then but you have to hear people speak Portuguese. People speaking, and I had this conversation, sort of a conversation partner, but she became kind of like a teacher from the Azores, and she was like, "You have to read literature from Portugal, right?" And one of the writers that she had me read was the writer Fernando Namora, who I believe was a doctor, and Namora was one of Portugal's important 20th century writers. And one of the interesting things was the language would be fairly simple, right? Sort of almost like the minimalist American writing in certain ways. But I would do these translations and she would say, no. And I would say, and she would say, this language has been spoken in this country for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. It has a rich resonance. It is not like American English. I was like, okay. Okay, so you told me I'm not gonna be able to do it right now. But it was instructive. It was instructive, you know, because it made me think very carefully about meaning, right? And okay, so let's set that aside. A few years ago, I posted about a translation. So there's a famous translation of Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak. And the first translation of this book, so to get it out, you know, the Soviet Union told him he wanted a Nobel Prize. The Soviet Union said, you're not going to go get the Nobel Prize. But he had someone sneak it out to Italy. It was translated from Russian to Italian. And then, I believe, it might have been Italian to English or Russian to English. So that early English translation, which comes out, I think, in the late 50s or 60s, early 60s, is incredibly poetic. It is dazzlingly, I think, poetic. It's as novels go, it's, you know, it has like this baggy plot and everything. You know, most people know the Dr. Zhivago movie, right? If people think of Dr. Zhivago, they think of Julie Christie and Omar Sharif, and you know, okay. But the novel is so interesting. I mean, he has moments of personification, because it was a poet. He was one of the great poets of the Russian language. So he's got these moments of personification that are just so vivid, it's just striking. So, Richard Bevere and Larissa Volkomsky, if they're in this room, forgive me, who are great translators from Russian. Let me just make that clear. And they did, I mean, their war and peace is amazing. Okay. So I got the version of Dr. Zhivago, and I'm reading through it, and I was shocked because it is so flat. It is, I mean, again and again and again, where Pasternak probably was higher because it was a man with his ear and eye of a poet. It just falls flat. And it's but technically, because I brought it to someone I, at the time, was, you know, working with, who was a native Russian speaker. And he said, well, this is blah, blah, blah. And so, of course, you know, what he was saying was, basically, you know, their translation is quite accurate, right? You know, it's not poetic, but it's accurate. But to me, that misses the point. Because the protagonist, Yuri Zhivago, is a poet. That's all. And at the end of the book, there you have Zhivago's poems. So, I mean, if you're missing the poetry in the prose, Lord help us when we get to Yuri Zhivago's poems. You know, he's got that famous line, you know, life is not a walk through an open field, something like that. You know, but so I mean, it's so to me, you're right. That's a huge ethical imperative, right? And then there's some writers, you know, very plain-spoken, very dry, very crisp, right? And so, you know, you don't want to punch that language up so that it becomes some idol. You want to punch the language up so it becomes something else, right? You know, but you want to be, I think, again, true to the spirit of the original. Sometimes it's very, very hard. Okay, one last thing I'll say. I want to just read this, end with this quote. Here I have this, end with this. Okay, so in the translation, in the translation of Kim Kyung-hee's Have You Been Feeling Blue These Days? Siblings Sungi Kim and Eun Song Kim say in their introduction of the work, the translation, in light of Kim's writing on the side of the week, and they're very clear to say that Kim Young-hee, this Korean, contemporary South Korean writer, writes on the side of the weak against neoconservatism and neoliberalism and, quote, neo-colony, neo-colonizer, mercenary state of South Korea that I love this. Quote, what we offer here are not translations, but our relationship between English and Korean. Quote, what is here is, this is so powerful, what is here is the semblance of a feeling that we hope you know we can witness only outside of language. Quote, what we have labored through is the acceptance of its distance and the hope of its pending something else. And then several pages later, quote, now at the request of no one, we interpret the power dynamics that structure our relationships and translate their ethical states. That to me is just, that is one of the best descriptions of what translation is, right? I mean, it's so amazing. And Sommer is a brilliant critic and as well as poet. But you know, what is here is the semblance of a feeling that we hope you know we can witness only outside of language. What is that?